Joining me now is author, speaker, educator, all-round legend, educational guru, inspirational bringer of information to teachers, James Anderson. James, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Cameron. It's great to be here again. It's been a while.
It has been. I think you may actually now take some sort of award as the longest term recurring guest. I think it was back in 2015 we last spoke.
Wow.
About your work on growth mindset back then.
Yeah, what a privilege.
So why don't we start with a quick fill in the gaps of the last nearly 10 years. So when we last spoke, you were particularly helping schools implement strategies for fostering growth mindset and to encourage student independent learning and self-efficacy in the classroom. And today we're going to be talking about particularly your new book, Learnership, and looking at learning mindsets and habits of mind. Fill us in between then and now. What have you been up to?
Look, the short version of it was the journey continued. There's all that work around mindset, which was basically around students understanding themselves as learners. And someone with a fixed mindset basically said, hey, this is me, get used to it. And they thought coming to school was about discovering what they were good at and what they could and couldn't do. And someone with a growth mindset said, well, I can change myself. I can put effort in and grow. I'm a learner. And the next obvious question to ask from that point is to say, well, if I can learn, how do I get really good at that learning process? How do I get better at getting better? And so the ideas naturally grew from there and ended up in this new book, Learnership. And there you go. That's 10 years in 10 seconds.
Well, obviously, there's a lot to unpack in what this new book and what the new program that you're helping schools with has to offer. The growth mindset stuff famously built on the work of Bandura and Carol Dweck. What are you bringing? What have you encountered, and what are you bringing into Learnership that's either from new sources or from new experiences?
Oh, look, there's an awful lot of stuff that you draw on. Like I said in the front of the book, there's the thought prints of a lot of people all the way through the book. But the four big ideas that I draw on through all my work, obviously Carol Dweck's work and the work around mindsets, the work around building expertise, Anders Ericsson's work that you might know from the sort of 10,000 hour rule and term deliberate practice, those sort of ideas. Then there's the work of Art Coster and Bennett Kalick, of course, around habits of mind. And those three ideas, the mindset is the sort of foundation because it gives you the understanding you're capable of growth. The habits of mind give you the actions you need to achieve growth. And the work of Ericsson describes the process you need to go through to achieve that growth. And the fourth author is the work around anti-fragile. Have you come across the work around anti-fragile with Nicholas Taleb?
No, tell me more.
Nicholas Taleb, extraordinary author, and if you want to read his book, he's got a series of books, but if you want to read his book, Anti-Fragile, very rigorous reading, put it that way. But basically he describes the concept of being anti-fragile is one where things benefit from disorder. And he basically makes the point that, in a world that we're now living in, where uncertainty is the only certainty and change is the only constant, that it's not enough just to learn more and to be a lifelong learner. You've actually got to leverage that disturbance. So he says that most people don't have an intuitive understanding of what that means. He says that if you ask most people, what's the opposite to fragile? They'll say things like strong or resilient and words like that. And he says, no, you've missed the point. He says that things that are fragile, you disturb them, they break. Things that are strong or robust needs lots of disturbance before they'll break. And resilient things are meant to sort of bounce back after the disturbance and return to that state. Whereas things that are anti-fragile are things that benefit from that disturbance. You'd wrap them in bubble wrap that says, drop me, it helps. And so when I put these three ideas of Dweck's understanding you're capable of growth, Coster and Kalick's idea of these are the behaviours you need to achieve growth, and Ericsson's idea of let's leverage challenge so we can actually grow and go through this process of growth. what we end up creating is someone that I describe as an agile learner. And the agile learner becomes anti-fragile because they leverage the challenge, they leverage the disturbance, they leverage that change around them in the environment to grow on a daily basis.
Sorry. Well, one of the things at the core of this that you've mentioned I'd like to unpack anti-fragile in a bit more detail later on, but the habits of mind and the particular sort of skill set implementation that from my understanding, the habits of mind provide, I suppose, the very practical application of some of this work. Would you mind walking us through that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I suppose if we come back a step and go forward 3, all those 4 authors, Erickson, Costa and Kalick, Dweck, and Taleb, the thing I love about their work is that they're not good ideas. All right, they're not someone who's come along and said, "Oh, I reckon this should work. Let's give it a try." There are plenty of good ideas in the world, and some of them are really valuable. But what all those 4 authors did was look at really highly achieving people and basically ask, what do they do? And so each of those 4 ideas are very, very real. They're founded in observations of high achievers rather than saying, "Oh, I think maybe we should do this." And so with Costa and Kalick's habits of mind, what they did is essentially went out, looked at high achievers and said, "You're in the best in the business of what you do. What is it you do?" And so they documented these patterns of behaviours, these dispositions or habits of mind. And there's 16 of them. You could argue that maybe there should be 18 or maybe there should only be 15, but my observation of schools that have worked with the habits of mind for a long time is that the 16 habits of mind are about the right size. They're small enough to be useful without creating 1,000 of them and being micro skills. And they're not so big that they're critical thinking or creative thinking, which is too big to hang on to. So what schools have been doing is to say, well, look, we've been building this foundation of mindset to say, look, kids starting to understand themselves as learners. And then the next question becomes, well, if I'm going to stretch myself, if I'm going to do what Erickson says and go beyond my current best into my learning zone, how do I behave? How do I achieve the growth? And one of the big things about the habits of mind was to recognise that it wasn't ever about using or applying the habits of mind. It was about developing, improving, extending, building the habits of mind, to recognise that the way that I persisted that got me to this level wasn't good enough to get me to the next level. And so I needed to be on this journey of constant growth in how I went about applying these habits of mind to allow me to achieve greater levels of growth, greater levels of success. So the schools that I work with, that was one of the big shifts that we made, that we went from using and applying the habits of mind, which inevitably ended up with many schools just being a labelling exercise. Cameron, you're really good at persisting, but James, you're not so good at it. Full stop. That was just a description. To saying, well, James, you're not very good at persisting at the moment. What are we going to do to help you get better at persisting? And so we made that sort of shift to developing, improving, extending, building.
Well, that's an interesting point you bring up, and I suppose maybe it's not even a philosophical question, but more of from your perspective as a person educating teachers and training school or working with schools to implement these processes. What you've just described, I think, is a bit of a perennial problem in education, the tendency for things to become labels or checklists, or, even when you think back to the muddled application of people's understanding of concepts like Gardner's multiple intelligences, for example, which just became this checklist of where do you fit? Oh, you fit here, therefore you do this. How do the perennial question, the philosophical question is, how do you get people to understand this difference between a set of beliefs or a value or a principle to motivate action and prevent it from becoming a checklist, a label, a tick box?
Yeah. Look, I've got two answers to that. The first one is the mistake we often make with these sorts of ideas with schools is, a new shiny thing comes along, and it's a great idea. We can see the value of the habits. We can see the value of multiple intelligences or mindset or whatever else might come along. And the first thing we do, which is the most natural thing in the world for teachers to do, is we teach it. And we teach it like it's a topic, right? We
Mm.
teach about the idea. And what we should have been doing right from the very beginning is to be teaching for that concept rather than about it. And when people talk to me about mindsets, they often, one of the first questions is, how do we teach this to kids? And I sort of go, do we really need to?
Mm.
Like, we don't actually need to teach the topic of mindset. What we need to do is to create an environment that nurtures an increasingly growth-orientated mindset. Now, look, there is research that says if you tell kids about mindset, they can be more metacognitively aware and all that sort of stuff, which is useful. But I actually challenge schools to say, don't talk about mindset. Do this work without mentioning the term mindset, and we'll be better off because it'll stop you from teaching about it. And it's the same thing with the habits of mind. The habits of mind, we do need to teach the labels that create the cognitive anchors, as Art Costa calls them. So we've got a way of recalling that pattern of behaviour that we're applying. But the real work starts when we say, well, this is how you apply the habits of mind at the moment. What are we going to do to change that into the future? And so the second part of that answer, once we move from teaching about it to teaching for it, is we're going to ask the question, well, this is about growth. This is about change. This is about growth mindset underneath it. And how do we create that environment that fills the classroom, fills the school community with what I call growth mindset movers, reminders, nudges, as I call them in my book, that help students nurture an increasingly growth-orientated mindset. Because that was one of the other pieces. It wasn't about fixed or growth. It was always about how growth-orientated you are. And we probably spoke about that in 2014 when we had our last conversation about the mindset continuum. And so I've created all these nudges, these little reminders that help teachers and the school community reshape those messages. So when you talk about Howard Gardner and we talk about, which intelligence are you and all the mistakes that happened around that,
Yeah.
what we need to remember is that learning is about creating, not discovering. And when we understand that process, right, so learning is about creating. It's not about working out what abilities I have. It's about creating the abilities I need. That helps us rephrase our way we talk about multiple intelligences. The way Howard Gardner in the last edition of, was it Frames of Mind? He had a very, very long preface to it where he talked about the way multiple intelligences have been adopted around the world. And he said that in the West, like you just said, we all said 7 or 8 intelligences. Which one have I got? Well, let's discover it. But in the East, they said 7 or 8 intelligences. How do I get good at all of them? And they took this process of creating those intelligences rather than discovering them. And that's why you've heard me say a couple of times in the interview already, I've used what I call a timestamp. This is how well I persist at the moment. This is how good I am at visual thinking right now. And when we attach timestamps to performance rather than to the student, it becomes about where you are, not who you are. And so to come back to the start of that question, where you're asking, how do we stop that labeling exercise? It's founded in the understanding that learning is about creating the growth mindset. And we remind students and teachers and our school community on a daily basis, just giving them these little nudges. And there's in my book, there's about 15 or 20 of them. I can't remember at last count. A few got edited in, a few got edited out. But they're all designed to help us remind us about that story of creating our abilities and how we go about doing that.
So obviously we won't be able to go through all of the 16 habits of mind in detail. Can you give us a quick overview of the sort of skills and mindsets they represent?
Yeah, well, if we're talking about the habits of mind, and habits of mind are just one part of this idea of learnership.
Hmm.
Um, but basically, okay, a couple of things to remember about them. First off, context is king. When we're talking about the habits of mind, it's not we use all the habits of mind all the time. Like, it's not like that. The way we talk about the habits of mind is to recognize that we've got a problem. And I'm fond at the moment of talking about the problem like a lock. Right? It's something we've got to undo. We've got to unlock the problem. And we've got to find the right 2, 3, or 4 habits of mind that suit that problem to unlock that particular one. And sometimes a habit of mind can be the wrong habit of mind. If you're trying to be spontaneous, generate ideas, do that sort of work, managing impulsivity is a bad thing. If you're doing an individual test, like we're prone to give students at the end of year 12, sit down, put your head down, do your test. If you decide at that point in time to think interdependently, we generally call that cheating. So you've got to choose the right set of habits of mind, but they span the gambit of human thinking, from things like persisting, managing impulsivity, the creative, creating, imagining, innovating, thinking flexibly, responding with wonderment and awe, remaining open to continuous learning, listening with empathy and understanding. All these different dispositions that, in my experience, as I said earlier, we could rename them, rearrange them. But this particular 16 are well tested, they're well researched, well developed, and they seem to fit well. They're about, like I said, they're about the right size.
And as you say, the habits of mind are just one part of the overall learnership concept that drives this book. What role does that play in your learnership model or learnership matrix? I think you called it. And what are those? What else goes alongside it to foster this growth in learners?
Yeah. So I talk about 5 elements of learnership. The first one is challenge. All right. So there is no growth without challenge. Challenge is what drives learning. And so a foundational part of learnership is to help students understand that the nature of challenge, that when we step into what we call our learning zone, which is loosely equivalent to what we might call the zone of proximal development. Have you heard the zone of proximal development?
I have, yes,
Yes.
yes.
Have you ever seen a child proximately develop?
No, funnily enough, no.
So, same idea, but it's about going beyond your current abilities, that we
Yeah,
don't get better by doing our best. We get better by stretching and challenging ourselves to go a little bit beyond our current best, which is what our
yeah,
learning
pushing
zone is all
yourself.
about.
Mm.
But a lot of people confuse that. A lot of people sort of say, oh, get outside your comfort zone, try something new. But there's a lot of things that are new in your world that are what I call easy things you haven't done yet. Things you've got the current abilities to do that just asked to do, yep, I can do that, do that, do that. It's not a real challenge. The challenges that drive growth are the ones that are just beyond your current abilities. And that's where the habits of mind come in. When you try to go from this level to the next level, you don't have the abilities to perform at that next level. Right? If you did, you would just do it. But the fact that you step beyond your current abilities and you go, I don't know how to do this, what do I do? Is a sign that your habits of mind aren't well enough developed to perform at that next level. What got you here won't get you there. And so you've got to look at that idea of saying, well, which of the habits of mind do I need to improve? Do I need to develop? Do I need to extend on? As you're doing that, as you're sort of working at that level beyond your current abilities, you need information. And the information you get is from your own internal sources, which we broadly call mistakes, and from external sources, which we broadly call feedback. The last part of the idea of learnership is what we call effort. And effort's a funny thing. Like, we talk a lot about effort, but for a lot of kids, effort kind of looks, a lot more like constipation than it does about growth. And this is what we talk about in the book. We sort of say that most people confuse effort for the amount of time and energy you spend on a topic. And we have kids that come up and say, "Oh, sir, I spent hours on this assignment. I really should get a good mark." And the teacher looks at it and goes, "Oh my God, what were you doing in those 5 hours?" They haven't spent the time and energy the right way. So when I talk about effort in the context of learnership, it's about recognizing that time and energy needs to be spent in our learning zone, developing our habits of mind. And when we do that, we engage in what I call effective effort, as opposed to ineffective effort or perhaps even performance effort that I explore in the book. So in terms of where the matrix sits, the 5 key elements are those ideas of challenge and your relationship to challenge, your habits of mind, and not just the habits of mind, but how you go about developing and exploring and building those habits of mind. Where you get information from in terms of mistakes and feedback, and how well you waste, spend, or invest your effort. And that allows us to describe these 6 levels of learnership, 6 levels of how skillfully you engage in the learning process.
Well, you mentioned that one of the challenges was getting schools not so much to teach these as topics or concepts, but to actually teach for them. Are you able to walk us through what that might look like on the ground about, what sort of practices or processes can teachers do to teach for effective challenge and effort, as well as the habits of mind?
Yeah, okay. So big question with a long answer.
You wrote a book about it.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I wrote a book about it, and I spent years in some schools working on that idea. So perhaps I'll come back just a step and sort of walk through how we go about doing this. Couple of steps about how we go about doing this. To start off with, I walk into a lot of schools, talk to a lot of school leaders, and teachers are exhausted. They're feeling under the pump. They're feeling, even if they can't articulate it straight away, they're often feeling like they're receiving a lot of blame for poor performance or not high enough performance. Certainly in the media, there's been a lot of pressure on teachers to make sure we're achieving better outcomes for kids. And my position is that we've been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years. Like we've been talking about Bob Marzano's work, John Hattie's work, a lot of work around teacher practice, teacher strategy, teacher pedagogy, even the current debate around direct instruction and all the rest of it. It's all about, teachers work harder, teachers get better results. But I came across some work by John Holt that sort of helped crystallize some of my thinking, where he said, learning is not the product of teaching. Learning is the product of the activity of learners. And I just went, oh my God, like it is, but it's so true. And teachers know this. Teachers in the last 5-10 years have all been told how important feedback is. And so they've gone to professional learning. They've been told how to write feedback, what to say, what not to say, how to say. And I just know teachers that have composed some beautiful feedback, either in writing or to say it to a student, and just gone, geez, I'm a good teacher. Look at this. This is exactly what it's meant to be like. And, with a note of pride in their step, they've sort of come up to the student and said, here's your feedback on your assignment. And the student's gone, yeah, whatever, and turned away and not even looked at it. And we've got these expert teachers, but what we're lacking is students knowing how to be expert learners. And so when I work with schools around this idea of learnership, it's about recognising we've got great teachers. What we need to do is to work on how students become expert learners. And to achieve growth, I use this analogy of sort of like, are you old enough to remember Torval and Dean?
I am, yeah.
Beautiful. With some horror, I realised that there were some people in my workshop a few weeks ago that weren't alive when Torval and Dean did it. For your younger listeners, Torval and Dean were a very famous pair of ice skaters at the '84 Olympics, and did a beautiful, all the 10 out of 10 sort of thing, ice skating. And I use that analogy for achieving growth in a classroom, that we need expert teachers, but it needs to be partnered with expert learning. Once we got that message across, and teachers are really receptive to it. Like, teachers go, oh, thank God someone's talking about it. Like, finally they recognise that I'm good at this, but it's not just up to me. Yes, I have an important role. No two ways about it. We need expert teachers. But it's a partnership. It's not solely up to the teacher. So once we've got that, we then say, well, how well do our students currently engage in the learning process? And that's where the levels of learnership come in. If you think about martial arts and sort of white belt to black belt, you can think about how expertise is built in that sort of process of, learnership is the same. At the bottom of the learnership matrix is what I call non-learners, who basically don't participate, they opt out, they choose to do nothing rather than something. And we've got, I think in many schools, some students who have some behaviours associated with that level. Beginning learners, which is the next level up, are the learners that love their path of least resistance. They're the students who choose the easy option all the time, that when you offer them options A, B and C, they say, you got option D? Got something easier for me? So these are the kids that are sort of ducking. They're active, they participate, they might be compliant to a degree, but they're certainly not stretching and challenging themselves. They think learning is a series of activities and it's done when you walk out the classroom. Then we've got performance learners, and these are the kids that love to do their best at the expense of not doing better.
Yes.
These are the kids that live what John Hattie calls the mini-max principle. They want the maximum results for the minimum possible effort. These are the kids that when you offer them, choose a topic of your choice. Let's do something really interesting, and you get to choose. They'll go, can I do the assignment I did last year because I did really well at that? They want to know what they can do well. And the problem with all those three learners, the non-beginning and performance learner, is none of them are going into their learning zone. All right, the performance learner is trading getting busy for getting better. Once we go to the directed learner, these are the learners that we were taught to teach. All right, directed learners are the learners that do what they're told. They are led, sometimes dragged through the learning process, and the teacher is in charge. And as we look at so much of the conversation in education these days, it's all about teacher does this, students follow along, and away we go. And we can get learning outcomes, right? We'll get 1 year's growth in 1 year's time and all that sort of stuff. But when we've only got directed learners in our classrooms, we've got learning occurring, but we're not creating learners. And I think that's a really important distinction, because we're so focused on measuring learning outcomes, meaning curriculum outcomes, the content that we're trying to cover, that we're not measuring how students are becoming learners. And when we talk about the sort of world that we were talking about before, where change is the only constant and uncertainty is the only certainty, and people that need to become anti-fragile to thrive in that world, directed learners won't cut it. We need learners that take charge of the learning process, and that's where the independent learner comes in. They start taking charge of the learning process. They can step into their learning zone of their own will. They don't have to be driven there. They don't have to be pushed there. And they're goal setters. These are the kids, these are the adults that will say, I've got somewhere to go. This is what I need to do to get there. I don't have the habits of mind to get me there. How do I develop those habits of mind? Away we go. But being goal-directed, their learning stops when they reach their goal. And so they're not continuously growing. It's the agile learner who embraces challenge in the spirit of JFK. We do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. The students who cultivate their habits of mind, they recognise those habits of mind as something they don't just need for their current challenges, but for the unpredictable challenges of the future. So they leverage the current challenges to build these habits of mind, so they're prepared for the future. They future-proof themselves. They design mistakes. They tailor feedback, which is something we don't talk about in the feedback discussions that we have. And they invest their time and energy in growth. So we've got these 6 levels. The next thing we do when we're working with a school is to go, well, where are your kids at? What level of learnership do you currently see in your school? And I've got a little tool, a little app we've developed to help sort of graph the, based on teacher observation, the levels of learnership in your school. And what we see a lot of is we've got a lot of students who are performance and directed learners. Individual schools vary according to their amounts. I've got some schools that are a lot of non and beginning learners, but we have a culture in our education system at the moment of performance, measure the outcomes, make sure it's achieved, demonstrate, these sorts of words, demonstrate, show, and teaching. Teachers in charge, teacher process, not just teaching, but effective teaching, the most effective teaching. Like, look at the words we use. I mean, we use the word teacher impact. I find that extraordinary. Like, teachers are meant to be impacting students with their teaching.
Yeah, it's a rather violent term, isn't it?
It is, where I think we need a more sort of, like that dance. It's a collaborative effort here. So we look at that. We look at the results that the individual school gets, and then sort of decide, well, based on where your kids are at, what do we need? Now, there's some commonalities. The focus we put on different schools and different times changes a bit, but it always starts with mindset. Mindset is the understanding you're capable of growth, and many of the poor learning behaviours that we see from some students are based in their fixed mindset. Basically, they're saying, no point in me trying, I'm just not good at that, so why try? And they've become what I call demotivated. Teachers will say, I've got unmotivated students, and try to motivate them by making it engaging and making it interesting, making it relevant. And it doesn't touch these kids. These kids are just going, well, you can make it as interesting as you like, but I'm still no good at it. And so they've been demotivated. They don't think they're capable of achieving the growth. And that leads to low aspirations and a whole lot of other things that go on. So mindset is a big starting point. The next part that drives all the growth is the student's relationship to challenge. And so we spend a lot of time talking about these zones of learning, where we talk about comfort zone, performance zone, and learning zone, and helping teachers help students to know when they're in each. Because for a lot of our students, learning's just learning. Like, they come to school to learn. And why this activity is easy and this activity makes them go, I don't know how to do that, is kind of a mystery. So our teachers start coming into classrooms, and we talk about some learning is easy in your comfort zone, an easy thing you haven't done yet. And you can multitask in your comfort zone. When it's that easy, it's familiar to you, do more than one thing at once. Performance zone, though, takes all your current resources, all your current abilities to concentrate, to be focused, to be intentional. You can't be distracted. You can't multi-perform. But both those things, performance and comfort, feel good, feel confident. You know you're going to do it. When you sat in on this podcast today, were you going, oh, geez, I don't know how this is going to go. Do I know how to press all the buttons? Do I know the questions to ask? Of course not. You've done this before. This is your performance zone. And same with me. But when we go into the learning zone, we don't immediately know the answer. It makes us go, and our initial reaction is to go, I'll just do something else. Like when I sat down to write Learnership, the new book, and I made the deliberate decision to go to the next level, to say it's not going to be like my last book, it's going to be even better. And I sat down to write it, and I went, I can't write without a tidy desk. Like, I'll have to clean the desk first. And but that's the way we react. And when that happens in our classrooms, students go, oh, I don't like doing that thing. Can I go back and do the easier questions? Can I show you the thing I can already do? And so a big part of the starting point is to make that learning zone explicit and help students understand that being in their learning zone is different to when they're in their performance or their comfort zone. And that feeling of discomfort, that feeling of stretch, that feeling of challenge is not the necessary evil. Like sometimes we say to kids, oh, just learning's hard sometimes. No, that learning zone is where the growth happens. I was reading Adam Grant's new book recently. Have you read Hidden Potential yet?
No, I haven't.
Reach out and have a look at it. He talks a lot about the same ideas as I talk about. He talks about how, in order to maximize growth, we need to become creatures of discomfort. And I think that's a beautiful way of describing it, that most of our students run away from that discomfort. They run away from that feeling of stretch and challenge. And when we help them understand that that feeling is where the growth happens, we get stories like one of the schools I was working with in Sydney, a school where students were labelled a lot. And I won't sort of go into it too much about which school they are, but they were told they were a particular type of high achieving student. And as a result, did all the things that students that are told you're high achieving do, is that they run for their performance zone, they protect themselves, they don't want to risk getting something wrong because then they wouldn't be special anymore. In any case, having done the work around mindset and challenge with this school, one of the teachers, after having worked with the student, said that the student stopped her on the way to class and said, "Miss, this class better be hard because I don't want to waste my time on easy stuff." I mean, that's awesome. And that's the sort of change that we're trying to see, that students start recognising that that feeling of discomfort isn't something to be avoided. It's something to be embraced. It's not something you feel all the time, all day, every day. But when you understand that that's your learning zone and that's where the growth happens, it's like going to the gym. And you come out of the gym and you've lifted your weights or you've gone on the run or whatever you do, and you come out and you're, a little bit sore. But you're sore with a smile because you know that that's worked. You're not hobbling out, being wheeled out in the back of a trolley going, I've broken something. But you've got just that right amount of can't do it quite to push the growth. And so that's where we sort of work with that. In most schools, the starting points are around recognising it's not just around teachers, it's around how learners engage in the process, making that explicit in the classroom to say, you're not just here to be taught, you're here to be a learner as well and to learn how to be an effective learner. Build that mindset foundation. It's all about understanding that you are a learner before you can become a skillful learner. Then the starting point, excuse me, the starting point is recognising that there is no growth without challenge. And so building that relationship with challenge is the first point. Then we go into say, well, where do the habits of mind play a role? Mistakes, feedback, and effort. And much longer conversation, and I talk about it in the book. We then build out a sort of 6-year scope and sequence for making learnership and the development of a growth mindset the culture of the school. We shift the culture from being a culture of teaching and performance to being a culture of learning and growth. And so that's where we sit.
Well, on that point, and to go back to what you said earlier about the fact that schools do have and education systems have cultures of performance and grades and measurable outcomes and that sort of thing, to make that shift of going from a culture of performance to a culture of learning growth. The example you gave of the student hoping for hard work over something they could do and get high grades on, obviously is a indicator of achieving or working towards that kind of goal effectively. But what sort of how do you get schools to combat the assumptions that culture of growth embeds? That sounds to me, that seems almost like the biggest challenge of all of this is how do you get schools, teachers, students, families on board with what may seem at first to be counter to that culture of performance.
Yeah. It's absolutely not a counter to it. I mean, it's counter to the culture. It's not counter to our goal, or our twin goals, one, of achieving those learning outcomes. This is not an either or thing.
Mm.
If you've got kids that are like this kid that we're talking about that said, this better be hard, what do you reckon's happening to his grades and his growth? I mean, because he's engaging in the learning process, because he's stretching and challenging himself and working on his habits of mind, so he's behaving in more intelligent ways and so forth, his results are going up and up and up and up. So it's not a case of, let's do the growth instead of the outcomes. It's a case of recognising that when we engage students more effectively in the learning process, their outcomes improve. It does make some shifts. This idea, we talk about students doing well at school, and one of the shifts that we have to make is that when we talk about doing well, what we often talk about is reliability, consistency, producing well at a particular standard. The shift that happens is we move from what I call sort of perfectionism, getting it exactly right 100%, to being about improvementism. And so doing well isn't about meeting a standard, it's about improving a standard. And Adam Grant, in his book, he puts it very well. He says that the problem with measuring ourselves against external standards or against other people is that we can succeed without growth. Yeah, because you ask any teacher in their classroom, they've got kids in their class that are going to meet the standards that year. Because the reality is it's well within their current abilities. And so they'll look like they're meeting their standards and getting the grades, but they're not actually improving. And so this is not, as I said before, an either or. It's about recognising that when students engage in the learning process more effectively, they get better short-term results. But more importantly, and I think this speaks to the question you're asking about, how do we get this? How do we sell this to principals? How do we sell this to teachers? Is that teachers are there and they are measured for those short-term outcomes. There's no two ways about that. We've got our testing and all the rest of it, and those outcomes are important. When students are engaging in that learning process more effectively, they get better outcomes and teachers feel more satisfied. But as I talk about sort of in the first couple of chapters of the book, that I went and spoke to a whole bunch of principals and said, what do you really want from schools? What do you really want students? And one principal put it, she said that the real measure of school success is not what the students are doing in 1 year's time. It's what they're doing in 20 years' time. Another principal said that he worried, and this sort of principle drove a lot of my thinking. He really worried about his kids that had low aspirations, that were happy with near enough is good enough. I can't aspire to this. I've only got this. And when we develop the skill of learning, when we help students develop a more growth understanding of themselves as learners, we raise their aspirations and we set them up for success, not just in school, but to thrive in life as well. Because I tell the story in the book about a teacher. Sorry, I always shake my head with this because it's such a classic story. A teacher I met in a school once, and she was getting some of the best results in her Year 12 business management class anywhere in the state. Now, your listeners will have heard me just say she got some of the best results in her Year 12 business management class and gone, yeah. She didn't get any results at all. Her students were getting the results. But in this teaching culture that we have in the system, all the credit and the promotion, I might add, went to her. And frankly, she deserved it because this teacher was an expert teacher. She drove students through the learning process and she worked harder than her students did. She was going through the students' books twice a week, working out what their learning needs were. If students didn't come back to their after-school meetings, she would chase them up and did all that sort of stuff. And as a result, her kids, on these external standards, did very well. When the students got to university the next year, what happened?
Not the same level of achievement.
That's right. Like I said before, she'd achieved the learning without creating the learners.
Yeah.
And so I think all the teachers that I've ever met got into teaching because, yes, they love their kids, they love their subject, they want to see students achieve. But they recognise that achievement as an 8-year-old, achievement as a 15-year-old isn't really what it's all about. What it's really all about is setting them up to succeed as adults and into their life. And we can make it look like, in this culture that we have of teaching and performance, yeah, we're meeting the standards, we're getting A's, we're doing these sort of things. Look, our kids are 1 year ahead of the expected standard. Well, that's great. What trajectory are they on for 20 years' time and so forth? And so your original question was, how do we get teachers on board? A big part of it is recognising they're good teachers, but it's not just about teaching, it's also about the learning. But it's also recognising that teachers want the best for kids, not just this year, but into the rest of their lives as well. And the short-term outcomes they're being asked to measure just don't cut it for the rest of life. Like the principal I was talking about before that said the measure of success is in 20 years' time, she's the principal at a moderately high achieving school in Sydney, and her HSC results, she doesn't even look at them much anymore. Most of her kids are getting university offers before they sit their final exams. So what's the use of measuring that standard? They're already doing the things they need to do to get into that next step.
Yeah, that's certainly an interesting one, because I know that that's been a subject of some contention in education spaces for a while about its effect on motivation and engagement with exams. But it does, to get back to that concept that we sort of started on, that I sort of wanted to unpack later, it also seems to lead nicely into this idea of being anti-fragile, because that performance culture and that fear of, when I said that they seem to be counter to each other, when you talk about doing things differently, people's minds will inherently go to the thing they're worried they're going to lose, which can often be a sense of certainty or a sense of control even. And, more often than not, that's just a matter of perception than reality. But with this idea of being anti-fragile, how do you foster a sense of seeing, being shaken, being impacted as a positive step towards growth? Because that, to me, seems to get right to the heart of this issue of the perception of losing something in trying to do something differently.
Why do you see it as losing something? What do you think you're losing?
No, I don't think you're losing something. I'm saying that when you, when you propose a shift in approach, or when anybody gets the sense of change, one of the first, we talk about humans fearing change as an almost natural tendency, and one of the first thoughts that people often have when they encounter something that's difficult, challenging, different, is, what am I losing, or how is my sense of comfort, control, stability being affected by this change, which tends to be what promotes negative responses to change and to new ideas. And that's that, to me, that sort of encapsulates that fragility that you were talking about before. Here's something new. Oh no, how's it going to affect me badly? As opposed to the anti-fragile that you were describing, where something new, something different, something challenging comes along and people go, great, throw it at me. How do I get myself into this? That seems to me to be one of the biggest mindset shifts that you're describing underpinning learnership.
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of things in there. First off, I'd say people don't fear change. What they fear is uncertainty. And what we need to understand about that is two things. One, that the change we're making in schools where we're developing learnership, the change is directional. It's about growth. When change is just change, and it's just, do this instead of doing that, then that's that feeling of, well, I was comfortable doing this. Why would I do that instead? and it's just wasted effort.
Mm.
But when the effort you're putting into change has direction, it's growth. It's about saying, well, I'm going to meet my short-term outcomes. I'm not just going to meet them, I'm going to improve them, and I'm going to improve my long-term outcomes. That feeling of uncertainty around the direction you're heading in isn't such an issue. But I think we're using the word uncertainty in two different ways. The second way is to recognise, like Adam Grant talked about, that we have for a long time felt, and this is a very fixed mindset response, that uncertainty, that discomfort, that I've got to tidy my desk up before I start because this is going to be hard, that's a natural human reaction, but it comes from the perception that that change is going to require more of me. And it's, I'm not expressing myself well here. Let me come back a step. From the fixed mindset perception, if that next step is hard, uncertain, it requires effort, then it's a sign that I've reached my limits. And it means that the next step after that is going to be harder. And the step after that, harder still. And the step after that, impossible. And so from the fixed mindset perception, the best response is to go, well, don't do that. Go find something that's easy for me, something I'm suited to. And this is where we start, the foundation of learnership is an understanding you're in charge of your growth, that you can change, that those limits move. Then, as we were talking about before, understanding that uncertainty, that change that we're asking students to lean into is where the growth happens, to become the creatures of discomfort. And we need them to understand that because there may have been a time many, many years ago where my business management teacher was good to go. Teach your kids what you need them to know, send them out into the world, tell them to do it for the rest of their lives. If the world was stable, then that would be good enough. But the world's not stable. And that's why in the 70s, you'll be surprised that this was said in the 70s. You'll remember the quote that, the illiterate of the 21st century won't be those that can't read and write. They'll be those who can't learn and unlearn.
Mm.
That was said in the 70s. And what it was in response to was the rate of change in the world. They're saying you can't just send people out into the world knowing stuff. They're going to have to be continuous learners throughout their lives. The world has continued to change, and the world is what we now call VUCA. You might have come across that term before. It's volatile, uncertain, challenging, and ambiguous. And it's not just the rate of change that is the issue. It is the nature of the change is becoming more and more challenging that is the issue.
Mm.
And in that environment, we need students, if we want them to thrive and flourish into their adult lives, that aren't just continuous learners, but they're learners that are out there saying, I cannot predict the future. Nicholas Taleb said, you can't predict the future, not because it's hard, but because it's actually impossible. He talked about what he calls black swan events, these highly impactful but highly unpredictable events.
Mm.
And so there's no preparing for them. You can't say, oh, look, I can see a pandemic coming in 5 years, I'll gear up for that. You just can't see it coming. So what we need to do is have adults coming out of our schools that leverage whatever challenges in front of them to develop skills and abilities that they predict will be important to them to use in the future. We future-proof them by leveraging the challenges around them. Now, at the moment, that performance and teaching culture doesn't do it. It just tells kids, follow my instructions, do what you're told, and then cross your fingers for the rest of the world's going to be all right. But when we develop learnership and when we help kids understand the nature of challenge and how they can develop their habits of mind and all the rest of it, they become, like we said before, the creatures of discomfort. Like JFK, we do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. The student who said to his teacher, don't give me easy stuff. I want hard stuff because the hard stuff helps me grow. And in doing that, you are constantly in a state of growth, of improvement, and you become anti-fragile. And when things like COVID come along, that unpredictable thing that may or may not have come across in your lifetime, the below the bar learners, the non-learners, the beginning learners, the performance learners, they all duck for cover. They're the learners that go, I can't deal with this, help, let's wait till things get back to normal. The directed learners, they're the ones that all put up their hand and say, well, no one told me how to deal with this, someone train me now.
Mm.
The independent learners are the ones that, and you'll recognise these ones, during COVID, had you ever used the word pivot or heard the word pivot used?
Yes, many times.
That's right. So before COVID, these people had their goals set for 2020 and the COVID came along and they went, well, that's not going to work anymore. So they took charge and pivoted. The Agile learner, on the other hand, had a different response. The Agile learner had one of two responses. They either said, this is fantastic. This is a once in a lifetime learning opportunity. What a great way to disrupt and generate the sort of challenge that's going to help us innovate and grow and become better at what we do. Or they said, oh, Cameron, mate, remember 3 years ago, there was that opportunity to learn how to do some stuff online, and we explored all those options about how to teach online and change our pedagogy and what was going to be involved and how the technology was. And we did it because we thought it'd be an interesting challenge because that'd help us grow.
Mm.
Hasn't that paid off, mate? And they were already prepared for the unpredictable challenge of the future. So I think that's why, at a very, very high level, we must make this shift, because we might prepare students for their Year 12 exams. We might get them good NAPLAN results, but we're not preparing them for 20, 30, 40 years down the track unless we're helping them become agile learners.
So you've mentioned that you've worked with a number of schools over a long period of time on this. What's that looking like in the schools that have adopted this learnership model?
It looks awesome on a whole lot of levels, from the teacher's satisfaction, from just their relief and saying, hey, it's not just me, it's also about the kids. It turns on a light bulb, a recognition that, how do we get the students engaged in this process? So there's a different feel, a different dynamic in the school. Some schools, like Asquith Girls' School in Sydney, have sort of been working with these ideas for several years now. They use the, what's it called in New South Wales? It's called the Tell Them For Me survey, which is like the well-being.
Sort of well-being survey almost.
Yeah. And every state's got their own version of the same sort of survey. But they run it just before I started working with them. And then we worked on mindset and all the rest of it, and they ran it again. They saw an increase in students setting more challenging goals of 12.5%. They saw students displaying high levels of perseverance increase by 30%. And the one that really struck me is like this is what it's about, is the teachers' expectations of students, right? The degree to which teachers hold high expectations for students rose by 8.5%. So not only have we got a lot of qualitative data, a lot of anecdotal data, but we're now starting to get this really quantitative data as well, saying that this is having an impact on what's going on in the classroom today. It's not just the 20 years' time, it'd be nice if we did it stuff, but it's going on in classrooms right now. And Asquith Girls were nominated as a Education Excellence Award for this work, which was really, really pleasing to see as well.
Well, James, thank you very much. The book is Learnership, Raising the Status of Learning from an Act to an Art in Your School. I will make sure there are links both to the book and to your website for those who would like to learn more or maybe have a further conversation with you. Thank you for your time, and thank you for bringing together these ideas into what seems to me to be a very cohesive and actionable model in schools. So thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure talking to you again, Cameron. Hopefully it's not 10 more years till the next conversation.
Hopefully not. Thanks again.